Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on inclusion. This is going to be a fairly short slideshow. It's just a few slides here, and what I want to use this lecture to do today is to give you a brief introduction to the topic of inclusion, what it is, why it exists, what it means in a legal sense, and how it looks in a classroom, both in the early childhood settings or in the elementary school years. So we'll start with talking about what inclusion is. It's actually important to know that there is no official definition of inclusion. So inclusion exists because of legislation. It exists because of federal law, which we'll talk about in just a minute. However, the term inclusion is not used in any of those laws. So inclusion itself is not a legal term. So there is no official definition for it. However, here's how we could describe it. Inclusion is allowing all children, regardless of ability, to participate actively in natural settings within their communities with their typically developing peers. So if you're going to think about perhaps an opposite of inclusion, right, it would be what we know existed back at the middle of the 20th century and before that, where most people who had any type of handicap or any type of special need were often institutionalized. So that's the opposite of inclusion, right? These children and those adults were not allowed to participate in natural settings within their communities with typically developing peers. They were isolated. So you can think about inclusion as the opposite of isolation. An inclusive program is a place where everyone belongs. So there's a place for everyone there. Everyone is accepted for who they are, no matter what their individual needs might be. It is a place where everyone is supported, and everyone supports their peers and other members of the program. So here we're talking about educational programs in the course of having their educational and their child care needs met. So that's what we want to see when we're looking at an ideal inclusive program. I want to give you a little bit of a brief history of inclusion and why inclusion exists today. So in 1975, the federal law, Education for All Handicapped Children, was passed. And this was the first time that our nation addressed, in a legal sense, how children who have different needs should be educated in our country. At this time, only about 1 out of 5 children who had any type of special needs were educated inclusively. The rest would most likely have been in those institutions that I was just talking about. If you think about some of the reasons why this law was passed, think about what was happening prior to 1975. In the 60s, we had the civil rights movement happening. We had a lot of discussion in our country about equal access and equal rights and how individuals should be treated, and the fact that differences don't make so much of a difference as far as who a human is and what their rights are. So all of those topics and all of that momentum in our country played into this law being passed. So that law existed, and then it was renamed in 1990, so it was reauthorized. A lot more language was added to it. It became a lot more detail. And in 1990, it was called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that's going to be abbreviated IDEA, and you'll see that in lots of places if you're reading about special education law. In 2004, IDEA was once again amended and reauthorized. It kept its same name. And so when we're talking about the IDEA law today, we're talking about the one that was passed in 2004. So this is the law that governs how schools are required to educate children. And we're talking about all children, regardless of what the disability might be. So this is everything from a child who is in a wheelchair to a child who has severe autism, to a child who has any other type of disability that you might be able to think of. And what IDEA did when it was passed again in 2004 is it put this language kind of out there into our nation. It requires that children with disabilities be educated in the least restrictive environment. This term is sometimes abbreviated LRE, and it's a really important one to know. What this term means, least restrictive environment, you have to remember that it's different for every child, different for every individual, but what it means is that every child has the right to be placed in the environment that is most typical, where they can still learn successfully. So I want to talk about that a little bit more on this next slide here. Having the least restrictive environment means that any school district must have a continuum of placements that is available. So we want a child to be able to learn typically, but IDEA recognizes that it's not always appropriate to place all children in the regular education classroom, right? We know that some children have needs that are too significant. They can't learn successfully in a regular education classroom with no additional support. And that's where this continuum of placements comes in. So school districts are required to have a continuum of placements available. So this can include instruction in a regular class. It can include special classes that are outside of the regular classroom, special schools. It can include home instruction. It can include instruction in a hospital or an institution. And it can include any sort of adaptation or variation on any of those. So there might be instruction in a regular classroom for part of the day and instruction in a special classroom for the other part of the day. It might be instruction in a regular classroom with the assistance of a paraprofessional. It might be instruction in a special school on some days and not on others. But what's important to know is that the school district is required to have this continuum of placements available for children. And so this is where that least restrictive environment comes in. The child's IEP team, their special education team, including their parents, has to determine what's least restrictive for that particular child. Where can that child learn successfully and be as close to that typical environment as possible? That's the goal that everyone's working towards. Having the child's life be as much like a typically developing child of that age, having their environment be as typical as possible. Think back to that definition I shared at the beginning, while still meeting the child's individual needs. It's also important to know that placement options are much more limited during the early childhood years. So this list of continuum of placements that I've just given you really only applies when we're talking about children once they're in the elementary years, right? There aren't all of these different options normally available for children when they're in preschool. And that is affected by a lot of different things. Preschool is not public in most places, so it's affected by that. Most children have not received a diagnosis of some disabilities during the preschool years, so that limits options that might be available. It's just a different it's a different time of life. It's a different type of program that's available. A lot of times, early childhood teachers are required to be more inclusive than a teacher in a public school or in an elementary classroom, because children from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of needs come to a preschool, and you don't even know to start with that some of your children have different needs at the beginning of the preschool year. So normally these teachers have to be much more prepared for all children and ready over the course of the year to find different options that will help children if they're suddenly displaying behavior or challenges or indicating that some type of non-typical development is happening for that child. Lastly, I just want to talk with you for a minute about some of the benefits of inclusion. So, again, not that long ago, a few decades ago, inclusion was never considered. If a child was not a typical child, they were not in a typical classroom. And today that's not the case. Today lots and lots and lots of children are included in mainstream classrooms, even though they have a variety of needs. Inclusion is not always implemented successfully. That's really important to know, and you're going to do some reading this week that's going to give you a chance to see that and to think about that a little bit more. But when inclusion is implemented successfully, there's a myriad of benefits. There are a lot of benefits that are there. I wanted to share this quote with you that's at the top of the slide here. When differences are acknowledged, differences can be greeted until difference makes no difference anymore. So the key here is knowing that inclusion isn't just about putting everyone together and pretending that everyone's the same. All educators know that everyone is not the same. All children have differences. And so when we're inclusively educating our children, we're acknowledging their differences in the way and in a manner that the difference doesn't make so much of a difference as educating the child does. So some of the benefits of inclusion. Inclusion can provide a stimulating, varied, responsive experience for children, much more so than if they were in a more isolating environment. And again, all of this depends on the specific needs of the individual child. Inclusion can provide curriculum activities that build on children's strengths and preferences and allow them to expand those strengths and preferences much more broadly than they might in one of those isolating environments. This third one here is one of the things that I think is especially beneficial about inclusion. When we talk about children being in a classroom environment with children who are different from them, we're talking about providing them with opportunities to observe, interact with, and imitate children who have acquired a higher level of skills. So this isn't something that just comes up when you're talking about inclusion or when you're talking about children with disabilities. This is even the argument behind multi-grade and multi-level classrooms, multi-age classrooms at all sorts of levels of education. And what we're talking about here is the fact that all children are on a range and a spectrum. We know this intuitively, that even if you have a classroom of all quote-unquote typically developing 5-year-olds, none of those 5-year-olds is exactly the same in every area of development than any other 5-year-old, because all children, all people, have their own strengths and weaknesses. And so we're talking about, when we're including children with all ranges of abilities in a classroom, we're talking about giving children the opportunity to learn from each other. We're talking about giving them an opportunity to see that different people have different strengths, different people have different abilities, different people can learn from each other. And this is beneficial both for the child who's learning and for the child who is teaching. There's a lot of research out there that supports these ideas. And lastly, to build upon that, an inclusive environment encourages the child to develop a repertoire of appropriate behavior, right? So a child who is spending time in an inclusive environment is seeing typically developing children demonstrate appropriate behavior and is becoming interested in developing those appropriate types of behavior because, as we know, choosing and knowing appropriate behavior, knowing those social norms, comes from social experience. It comes from a social environment and from social relationships. And so if a child is isolated from those, they lose the possible benefits that they could gain from those types of interactions. So that's inclusion, a brief introduction to it. Here are some of the references that I used for the slideshow. And now I'm going to ask you to do that reading so that you can continue to think about inclusion, both its benefits as well as some of its challenges.